lots of dramatic plowshares actions, including the one pictured on crossing the line, 3 women who did a plowshares action in Scotland, because the Brits have nuclear Trident submarines up there as well. And they call it sterilization. They threw a whole bunch of computers into the lock. They were acquitted because the people in Europe know war. We don't very often get acquittals for plowshares. There'll be a plowshares trial in May, we think, because 3 plowshares activists got into the sort of inner sanctum of the Y-12 nuclear weapons plant up in Oak Ridge. And the government's mightily embarrassed, as they were, when Bill and Sue got into the first strike section of Griffiths. Sometimes we think that maybe plowshares are helping increase security, but given the miracles that happen, I don't think the security is really increasing. Now, most of the plowshares don't get acquittals. I've told 2 acquittal stories. So a good portion of both of these books tell about what's it like in prison, what's it like in jail. Now, there's a huge difference, and Bill has alluded to it. Prison can in many ways be more comfortable because it's federal, they have more laws, there's more different levels. But you don't go to prison for just a couple days. You go to prison for a long time. Of course, losing your freedom is something people have to think very hard about. Phil Berrigan says, and I think it's really true now since they passed NDAA and since 9/11, we're all in minimum security. I'm not going to go so far as to say there are surveillance people here, but I have been spied upon in the Catholic Worker House in Saginaw. I was spied upon in the Saginaw Valley Peace Watch in the 80s. I mean, this is a podunk little town, you know, and we've had infiltrators. The one in the Iraq War, they threw the case out because it was so obvious that the cops were playing baby FBI. But we're all in minimum security. We have lost a lot of our freedoms. One of the more interesting interviews was with Steve Downs, who was an attorney, kind of a functionary attorney. He worked for the state of New York and investigated judicial misconduct. So he didn't go to trial. Steve was heard about a group of people that got arrested at Crossgates Mall for wearing a Peace Now t-shirt. And it just kind of got his goat. He couldn't get it out of his head. So this was in December, before the second Iraq War. And so he and his son bought a t-shirt. I think his said, "Give peace a chance." Not exactly a very edgy slogan compared to other t-shirts you have seen and maybe worn. And they went out to the mall. His son left when he was asked to leave. Steve just decided to sit in the food court and not take off his t-shirt and not leave. So he was arrested, taken to night court. The judge, magistrate at night court thought this was a little weird, but, you know, arraigned him and gave him a court date or whatever. So Steve went home thinking that was all it would be, but he told his boss the next day, and his boss got it to AP, and this t-shirt arrest went around the world for about, 5 days. There was just this big, huge outcry. Steve Downs now is working full-time for human rights, particularly for Muslim human rights, people who have been wrongly arrested here. He works, he founded a nonprofit defense fund, and he works full-time. So he left his cushy little job and is working full-time for all of our civil rights. The other part of the story that I think is kind of amazing, because it just galls me. About 3 weeks after the little hoopla about his t-shirt had calmed down, there's a Cox Christie group in Albany was going down to New York for one of the big marches that we were all having before the Iraq War started. And there's a reporter on the bus, and so she asked the leader of the group, well, tell me now, you put Steve Downs up to this, didn't you? And the lady said, well, no, I didn't even know him until this came out. The reporter said, oh, then it was a real action. And what that means is that if we're working together in community, it's not real. I think it's more real. I think it's the only way that change will happen. And that's why I focused this book on resistance, family, and community. Because it's family and communities working together that are going to make changes. And it's family and community that needs to support, necessarily supports the resistors who choose to do CD and go to prison. So in some ways we all are doing time when people like Bill and Sue, Brian Terrell, who's now serving 6 months for resisting the drones in Kansas City, the people in Hancock, which is close to where Griffith is, are serving 3 weeks, I think, for a drone action. That kind of thing takes the support of all of us. We are really all doing time. Harry Murray is one of the more interesting interviews. I guess I like him because I was an academic for 23 years. And Harry's an academic. He teaches in Rochester, New York at Nazareth College. Harry is able, by a lot of good planning, to combine resistance, fatherhood, and college teaching. And he, in fact, he was on trial once when his criminal justice class, they came to the trial, on trial while he was teaching criminal justice class. His wife, Mary Ann, said the first time he spent time in jail, the kids were kind of small, next time I'm going to go to jail, you take the kids. Because it's hard. The people who do the time at home often have the hardest part. They have to take over for the person who's in prison or jail. But more than that, they have to face all the criticism and the questions and the phone calls. And the person in jail, I'm not saying it's fun, but the person in jail has themselves to be with. So we have a lot of stories in here about the communities and the families that support resistors, because they're all doing resistance, and that's really the focus of this book. Whereas the focus of Crossing the Line, there are lots of families in there, but the focus is more on the individuals and more of a historical effect. For instance, there's a whole chapter on School of the Americas in that book. I'm sure some of you have been to the protests in Fort Benning. Here, the School of the Americas is done in the context of the Syracuse Peace Community, because they go down together, often are arrested together, and support the people at home support the people in jail. Because that community support is extremely necessary. I'm going to stop talking now, but I want to say just a couple things. Personal. What did I learn? I learned, first of all, that being arrested can be a tremendously liberating thing. As Robert Ellsberg says, Robert Ellsberg is Dan Ellsberg's son, and he also happens to be the editor of my second book, the book about Dorothy Day. But Robert said, the first time, that first crossing the line, when you're suddenly into a kind of outlaw category, it's liberating, and it opens up these possibilities of what you can do. So many people echoed that. Young people said that, you know, it was a kind of a growing up, a coming of age. Older people, many of whom waited till their children were grown before they were arrested, said that for the first time in their life they were able to do what they really believed in. And that makes up for the tremendous pressures and degradation of losing your freedom. Michelle Nar-Obed, who did a Plowshares Action and suffered gravely within her family for it, did it because she said she'd like to be another link in the fence so that the dreams and visions of peace don't get lost. That somebody from this generation puts them into human practice and leaves them for the generations following. And so that's another thing I learned, and I think David mentioned this kind of at the first. We don't know what effect civil disobedience has. Almost everyone I interviewed talked about being inspired by Phil Baird and by others that have gone before. But we don't know about the people who may have heard about it and don't know at all. It's a little bit like teaching. You really don't know what happens in your classroom. You hear little bits and pieces of it, but you don't know the whole thing. So you don't know the effect. The effects, we think, are much greater than those you can see. Because we have to admit, the war machine goes chugging along and gets bigger and bigger. And I think that some people who are just looking at immediate effects can get discouraged and say, why bother? But the people in Doing Time for Peace know that it's more than a bother, that it's necessary. So that's one thing I learned. And the other thing I learned that was personally very comforting to me is that going to jail and prison is doable. I can do it. It's not the end of the world. I sometimes think that my Catholic Worker book was a how-to book on how to be a Catholic worker, and young people use it, and people starting Catholic workers use it that way. This is kind of a how-to on doing time. So when people are considering doing time, the questions raised in here, because it's not a sugarcoating book at all, the questions that the narrators raised, I think are things that people should think about. And I learned personally, I'm not afraid of prison anymore. I still won't like the noise. I don't like noise. I don't like television blaring at me and things like that. I know I won't like the noise, and jails are particularly noisy. But it's doable, and there are ways you can deal with it. And there are also ways that you can be really fully with the people in the prison and get the kind of first-hand knowledge that will help in all sorts of ways. Prison abolition movement, working with prisoners after release. So there's a lot of kind of, I don't know what I call them, fringe benefits, I guess. But most of all, I learned that I'm not afraid of prison anymore. And that in itself is extremely liberating. So that's the end of my spiel. I hope we have lots of questions, particularly on effectiveness, what is violence, how does this relate to the peace movement as a whole, how do you decide where to be when there's so many problems? I think there's a lot of things we can talk about. So, thank you.
How does this relate to the Occupy movement? Where do we fit in?
Right. Well, I finished my interviews in 2007, so I don't have any, stories of the Occupy movement, or people didn't talk about it because it didn't exist. It took me another 5 years to cut the interviews down, to winnow them, to decide. I have 27 people I couldn't use, and I feel really bad about that. But Father Lou Vitale, whose hands are here, talked about the young people in San Francisco at the start of the Second Iraq War, and he could have been talking about Occupy because he sees a tremendous optimism and hope and creativity in the young people. I think a lot of people think Occupy is dead. I think the media does. It ain't. Occupy is the one who did the relief after Sandy. Occupy people are doing things still and will. I personally, and I'm certainly not a political scientist, David's a whole lot better than I am in that kind of thing. I think the anti-drone movement is really going to take off. I think particularly the fact that we can have drones flying around our cities, spying on us, is going to get to people, and that's one of the things you're working on here. And I think we're going to see people in the Occupy movement, you know, coming up for that, particularly coming up for environmental things. I think that's going to be really strong. In my, the book party my daughter gave me in North Shore of Chicago had a real mix of people there. It had a lot of my peace friends and a lot of North Shore young people. And one woman said, you know, I can't see nuclear weapons. She works down in Englewood, which is the very depressed part of the south side of Chicago. She said, I can see the poverty down there and the food scarcity and, you know, all the bad things in a ghetto. She said, I can't see nuclear weapons. How can you be against something you can't see? And I think that's a real problem. I mean, you know, the government has been quite successful at keeping the horror of nuclear weapons from us. So I think that's a problem that the peace movement needs to face. It's so unthinkable that nobody thinks about it. And I think that's a real problem. Whether the Occupy would ever go big on nuclear weapons, I can't see that.
You know, yeah, that's you kind of like saw my question, because I was going to ask very often, because I've been involved in some movements, and you see the peace, you know, movement activism a lot of times is very segmented. You know, there are the peace activists, and there are this, and in talking to these folks, did you see them making a lot of the connections with other stuff?
I think they make the connections, but they have to decide to concentrate. Particularly the plowshares activists, they see nuclear weapons as the taproot of violence. Because we have so unthinkingly accepted the fact that we can kill the whole world 99 times over, that acceptance of violence permeates our whole society. So the gun control and, you know, the violent TV games and everything, we are just so permeated by violence. I do think that most people that I spoke to, partly because I have, you know, as living as a Catholic worker and writing the first two books, I knew these people live very simply, live as environmentally as they can, are concerned about the environment, but feel that the peace movement is where they need to put their energies. I could have written this book about, particularly if I went to the West Coast a lot, you know, I could have written, we could write books about nuclear or environmental activists too, and I think that kind of oral history is being done. I'm a member of a group called Groundswell that uses oral history for activist purposes. And we need to have a lot of stories like this, because I do think it's stories that encourage people to action. So yeah, they made the connections, but the people, for the purposes of my book, we just talked about, I had to choose something. So, because this is my personal passion, is nonviolent. Shelley, do you have any questions? You don't have to. Other questions?
I've been wondering for some time, I got a good question. I've been wondering for some time, is there anything that people who are interested in the peace movement that we should be doing, not them, but us, that would grab the attention of people more than we do now? Like somebody came here on the drones some months ago and spoke about that, but not here. I think Mamatra did at another place. And I said, well, why don't we make one of the big things is every war now is a war against children. And that's true in most of these poorer countries. The majority of people are children. And something like that, people over here, it's hard to get their attention on anything that would grab them. And I don't know is there anything that you see that we should be looking at or speaking about along with what has already taken place, not to replace it.
I wish I knew. I wish I knew what would galvanize and get people into the streets. I don't. I think the fact, I guess I'm most hopeful that the unfairness of the drones, the fact that, people sit and play essentially a video game and kids in Pakistan are killed, I think that has some chance of getting people. But the way our culture is today, with everything being important for 5 minutes and then something else coming up, I do think the economy is finally showing people that the budget disparities, but that's not going to get people on the streets. People are not excited about, economic matters. They're excited about it, but they don't go march on it too much. I wish I knew. I really wish I knew what would get people out. I'd love to have some answers. Yeah.
I have a question. Is anybody doing similar oral history of the broader peace movement in recent years? Because one of the most frustrating things for me is my inability to get down on paper or video or any other way the incredible volume of incredible stories that people have that are very different from these. People who have day jobs, people who show up in those moments at Camp Casey or on the National Mall, people who are disrupting events, people who are passing resolutions, people who are protesting at factories. It's incredibly frustrating, the quality of the stories and the volume of the stories that, as far as I know, nobody's taking down.
Not that I know of, although I'm certainly encouraging people, particularly through Groundswell. They're working more on projects involving community groups, which is part of it. And the difficulty in doing oral history is you should plan Plowshares Actions and other witnesses in campaigns. I should plan oral history better than I do, and to try to plan, because of that, it takes so long to write them, to plan something like that and try to get anything representative is difficult. Because people work in communities. I think there should be an oral history of the Charlottesville peace movement. The Charlottesville progressive. There should be local oral histories. And people are doing things like this. I like to publish books, but I'm also aware that there are lots of other ways to do oral history that aren't quite as time consuming as the way I do it. There are lots of people are recording the interviews and having them available in audio, doing YouTube, that kind of thing. But I think it'd be great if somebody would try something like that, but it's almost too big to do. Because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of groups like the people sitting in this room. And we need to be talking to each other. I don't think we need to wait for a leader. That's personally, the thing that's excited me the most about the Occupy movement is that they didn't wait around for a leader, And we were sitting in our little Evanston Occupy, having our, what is the meeting called that you go like this all the time?
All your fingers.
General
you
Assembly.
you do that.
Twinkle toe, twinkle fingers.
Anyway, we're having a little meeting. And a fellow came from Bloomington, Illinois, and he had heard that we were having our meeting, and he was visiting us from the Occupy in Bloomington, Illinois, another kind of small college town. That was just really cool. I think that's happening all over the world. And I mean the world.